Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation, Building Resilience, Navigating the Long-Term Impact of Trauma. And before we begin this presentation, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 is hosted at CCHL, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and the peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them in this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land as well. My name is Andrew Tomeyer. I am N4's Education Coordinator. I will be hosting and monitoring today's presentation. Here today as well, we have my colleague and co-host Colleen Drake, Engagement Coordinator, who will be monitoring the Q&A box today. I'm now pleased to introduce you to today's presenter. I'm going to ask that you turn on your video as I introduce you. Bianca Briciu is Assistant Professor at the School of Leadership, Ecology, and Equity at St. Paul University. Dr. Briciu's work focuses on integral leadership development through emotional and social intelligence, mindfulness, compassion, and systems thinking. Her PhD is in cultural mediations, where she specializes in interdisciplinary approaches for intercultural competence. Bianca is interested in transformative leadership and the cultivation of human potential in all areas of intelligence. She has 7 peer-reviewed publications on mindfulness, compassion, gender equality, and transformative practices for resilience, care, and well-being. Bianca is also a certified coach in EQI 2.0 model of the emotional intelligence and leadership. Welcome, Bianca.
Thank you very much for having me today for this webinar, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Yes, indeed. I'll just do a quick house rules before we begin. And yes, welcome. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our N4 platform, and we'll share this with you as soon as it becomes available. Should there be any technical issues during this presentation, we will inform you with details for an alternate makeup session as well. And N4 is pleased to announce that this webinar is accredited to members of the Canadian College of Health Leaders. CCHL individuals earn credits towards their maintenance of certification requirements by attending today's webinar. CCHL members will receive a 0.5 Category 2 credit for attending. And before we begin as well, we'd like to just take a moment to introduce you to this platform feature with respect to the Q&A. Today's session, we do invite you to write your questions to the Q&A box. We know that sometimes many of you might have similar questions or be interested in a particular response, so you do have the option to upvote questions. Please upvote questions that we pose to Bianca, or please put your questions in the Q&A box so we can pose them to Bianca as well. And with that said, Bianca has no conflicts of interest to declare, so let's jump right into today's presentation, and I'll pass the virtual podium over to Bianca. Thank you again, and take it away.
Thank you, Andrew, for this introduction, and I'm going to start sharing my presentation with you. The topic for this presentation is about the long-term impact of trauma, because the knowledge that we have of trauma is very much connected to post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is very well known, but we know less about the impact of trauma across the lifespan and how we can work with that in order to build resilience and in order to allow ourselves to transform together with life in a positive way. So just as Andrew mentioned, I wanted to say very briefly that at St. Paul University, I also have the pleasure to collaborate with N4 for a program called Fostering Integration for IEHPs from Learning to Action. And this is where I also teach a module on trauma and resilience. And I wanted to start this talk with a quote from Nelson Mandela, who says, "Do not judge me by my success, judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again." And I think this is a quote that reflects a lot of the experiences of immigrants and refugees who come to Canada, and those who move to other countries as well, and those who succeed despite all the odds and despite all the obstacles that they encounter along the way. So I will first start with a definition of trauma, and I will give you just a few different definitions to have a sense of the complexity of the term. One of the definitions is that trauma is an injury, and mostly psychological injury in this case, that results from experiences that overwhelm our emotional coping system. As a rule, we have our coping systems for difficulties and stresses of life, but when that stress surpasses our capacity to respond, then we move into an adaptation. Our psychological system starts to adapt to circumstances that are adverse to our well-being and our thriving. And that can lead to long-term protection mechanisms, right? So our own psychological system can change according to these adverse circumstances, and that it can remain the same over many years of our lives, if not for our entire life. Another definition is that trauma is an experience or a series of experiences that break or betray our inherent needs for safety, belonging, and dignity. And this definition focuses on our basic human needs that we all have, and when the environment is betraying these needs, or when it makes it impossible for us to live and respond to these needs, then we will experience trauma. And there are these two different aspects of trauma, and that's why it's sometimes confusing for people who to understand the differences, is that the acute trauma can come from this sudden violent event that happens to us, like a natural disaster, war, violence, an accident, the death of someone close to us, right? So this is a sudden event that has a powerful impact on us. And then we have what is called the complex, or the small t, versus the capital T trauma, that comes from long-term stressful experiences of discrimination, of poverty, lack of basic needs, toxic prolonged stress, displacement, right? So losing one's capacity to belong. And the first definition of PTSD, it's interesting that it's quite a recent definition. It was defined in the American Psychiatric Association in the 1980s, and mostly in order to study the experiences of people who were returning from the war and who had all kinds of psychological symptoms that needed to be addressed. So trauma affects our immune system, our stress tolerance, and our worldview. So it impacts how we see the world and how we exist in the world. And this is why it's important to understand these long-term effects of trauma. The types of trauma are multiple. The first one is the primary trauma, when this difficult event happens directly to us. Then there is secondary trauma, when we can be witnesses to someone undergoing violence. We could experience vicarious trauma, that is also known as compassion fatigue. And a lot of people who work in the health sector are acquainted to this vicarious type of trauma, when we are affected by the difficult experiences and the suffering of people that we work with. Then there is intergenerational trauma, the transmission of trauma effects from parents to children and then to a few generations. Studies have demonstrated up to 3 generations transmissions. I think that we didn't yet have the capacity to study the longer term over even more generations. But for example, studies of children of people who have experienced the Holocaust, they showed similar symptoms to their parents, and sometimes nightmares and either physical or psychological symptoms that were very similar, even though they did not have that experience. And what is particularly important about intergenerational trauma is for parents to be able to use stories to tell children about what happens, because especially in cases when their suffering is kept secret and their traumas are kept secret and hidden, that tends to affect their children even more, because then children have all these bizarre symptoms without even understanding a little bit the context and the stories of their parents and their ancestors. Then we have collective trauma, traumas that can be experienced by a whole population as a result of ethnic wars or religious-based conflict. And the last one is moral injury. And moral injury is also a type of trauma that could be experienced when you work as, in frontline positions, and you're witness to certain forms of violence and abuse without being able to intervene. And that can lead to very powerful forms of suffering. Or when we want to do something that we know it's human and it's compassionate, but we cannot do it because of the rules and regulations. And this is a situation sometimes those who work in healthcare may encounter in their workplace. So the trauma effects, and I'm going to talk about both the short-term and the longer effects of trauma. So a book written by Gabor Mate called The Myth of Normal talks about these longer-term trauma effects as the inner injury or split within the self due to stressful events. So you can think of our psychological system as a whole, that works in harmony, the same way our body is a functional system in itself and it maintains its homeostasis or health, the same way our psychological system desires to maintain that. But when we encounter a very difficult experience, a part of us, or we feel that sometimes we use the metaphor of feeling broken. So the unresolved trauma can lead to the adaptation to harm. That adaptation to harm means that our psychological system adapts to conditions of violence, or it adapts to conditions of discrimination or conditions of injustice. And that means that something in us is not whole anymore, right? It becomes difficult to feel truly engaged and to feel that aliveness that comes with feeling truly engaged and safe in the way we live our lives. And especially these two, there are these two large reactions. One is the lack of safety. So the experience of anxiety, and especially it's interesting that the last few decades show an increase in anxiety in the general population, a constant lack of safety and feeling worry, right, about things that happen to us, which can be a trauma adaptation. Our mind thinks that we are in danger, even if we are not in our real life circumstances. And the second large or long-term adaptation is dissociation or numbing. We start disconnecting from our capacity to feel, right? We feel less and less, and then we can live our lives and doing whatever we need to do, but we are not truly engaged in our whole capacity to feel and to respond to the world. And trauma can keep us stuck in the past. It's almost like a part of us remains in the past in the difficult experience. One of the studies that really shifted the discourse about the long-term effects of trauma is a study called Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was showing, and I'm going to explain that in this slide, that it was a study of almost 14,000 adults that followed them over their lifespan, from childhood until to their old age. And the study compared adverse childhood experiences such as violence, abuse, mental health issues in the family to adult risk behavior, health status, and disease. And this study that was huge, right, in this magnitude, both longitudinal and in terms of the number of people involved, showed that people who had more than 4 categories of adverse childhood experiences, they had 4 to 12 times increased health risks for mental health issues, for addiction. And they also had more than double the risk of heart attack, cancer, stroke, or diabetes. So the study showed that these experiences of trauma in childhood could have long-term repercussions on people's mental health and physical health as well. And that led to public discourse about the need to create safer families and safer conditions for people to live in order to prevent these long-term effects. The short-term effects that can sometimes turn into long-term if not addressed, or sometimes they can disappear after a while, even if not addressed, are physical symptoms like the hypervigilance, nightmares, or experiences of illness. And this is what we call stress, right? We use a lot the word stress. Oh, you are probably sick because of your stress, or your immune system is low because of stress. And stress becomes this cover-all word for it. But in fact, it implies these trauma adaptations, plus the real stresses that can exist around us in our life. Another symptom is behavioral, such as addiction, self-harm, feeling of isolation, right? Not being able to connect to people. Interpersonal, it leads to conflict and a constant state of aggression, lack of trust and poor boundaries. At the cognitive level, a lack of concentration, memory loss, a sense of powerlessness. Emotional symptoms of depression, anxiety, or a sense of numbness and really disconnection from the capacity to feel, right? We feel as if we are a little bit removed from our life, right? We just go through the motions. That's the feeling that people may experience. And it can also affect us at a spiritual level through a pervading sense of guilt, shame, or despair. So all these symptoms are found in a lot of the expression of mental health problems that in fact have their origin in many of these difficult experiences or extremely stressful experiences. And I wanted to mention as well that displacement and having to move from one place to another, especially unwillingly, right, when we don't really want to, that can also have a very stressful impact on our lives, and sometimes even traumatic impact on our lives, because we exist in relationships. As you see in this figure, we tend to think of the individual as this, unit who is free to move, here and there. But in fact, the individual is constantly connected to something larger, right? To a family, an intimate network, to a community, to a certain institution, to one's larger social environment, and the landscape where we live. And when people are forced to move, for circumstances that are beyond their control, they experience a sense of loss. And many people who arrive here in Canada have gone through these experiences of loss and vulnerability, because you become open to the unknown. You're removed as an individual from your space of belonging and entering an environment where you have to create all these spaces for yourself. And that can lead to disruptions of our identity. People feel this sense of being caught between places, not belonging to their place of origin, but neither to the new place. It can take many years until they can feel safe and they can feel at home in a new place. And sometimes we refer to these experiences as culture shock. That is an experience of alienation, which is more difficult for some people than others, right? Depending on how connected you were to your larger network in your place of origin or the place that you lost. And I wanted to mention these three fundamental human needs that lead to an experience of trauma, especially in cases where they are not met, right? The basic needs for safety, belonging, and dignity. And we refer to these fundamental human needs, especially in human rights frameworks. But these needs are frequently not met for a lot of people, and they are not met for migrants or immigrants or refugees in particular. The need for safety, that is very well known, because we have this basic human desire to have the integrity of our body and mind, to not be subject to violence, whether psychological or physical. Then the need for belonging is about our desire for connection with others, for love, for care, for relating to others in ways that are nurturing. And sometimes this need for belonging can be defied, especially when we move to different places where we don't yet have a community. The need for dignity is our need to feel our inherent worth and value in a larger context, to be seen and valued for who we are. And this is really important, especially in terms of finding one's professional place, you know, as you moved from one country to another, in order to be able to feel your value as a professional and to be recognized for the skills and capacities that you can contribute. When we cannot do that, you know, that can lead to a lot of stress. And we have seen in our program the impact that it can have, for example, on doctors and nurses who are educated abroad and who are looking for a job, and sometimes they have to wait for years before being able to work. That can build an enormous amount of stress, and it can have a negative, you know, long-term impact. So migration creates a break in our sense of belonging and our need to belong. And difficult circumstances in our countries of origin, like war or economic hardship or corruption, can also make people feel alienated from that place of origin, which again is a rupture in belonging that can be a traumatic rupture for some people, whereas for others it has less of an effect. And the loss of belonging leads to isolation and powerlessness, to a sense of feeling abandoned, a sense that we don't matter. And this is the time when we are removed from that, you know, larger community, and we have to exist as individuals who don't belong and who have to prove themselves and who have to find their place somewhere. Because being part of a group is inherent to our very being, right? As despite our individualist culture, this need to belong is fundamental. So it's good to reflect a little bit on the communities where you feel belonging, those people that you feel belonging with, right? Who make you feel that you are worthy and you are valuable. And it's interesting that a study in Canada shows that immigrants form almost a quarter of the healthcare and social assistant workforce. So we have a lot of people who are coming from abroad to work in Canada. 29% of all nursing and healthcare support occupations, 26% of physicians. And there are still a lot of nurses and physicians who are trying to find a place for themselves. And now I will move on to define resilience. So I didn't mean to give you this gloom picture that if you experienced a trauma in your life, which the majority of people did, either one or the other, the sense that there is a lot of hope, right? There is a lot of growth that can come from experiences of trauma in terms of expanding our consciousness, in terms of understanding reality more and having more compassion for others as well. This is something that I will mention towards the end of the presentation. So the definition of resilience is the capacity to overcome life challenges and obstacles, right? You can think of resilience as our power to overcome adversity. If trauma is the way adversity impacts us and changes us and shapes us into certain ways of being, resilience is how we can recover our power and respond to this adversity in ways that are not destructive or constrictive of our experience. So resilience is the ability to cope effectively when we are faced with adversity, minimizing stress and enhancing protective factors. At all times in our lives, we have experiences of stress, and then we have protective factors, right? So we have the good and the bad are both in our hands in a sense. So A more recent study of resilience highlights the fact that resilience is not just an individual trait. It's not just our personality or how much self-care we do, but it's also connected to the capacity of an environment and of a society and of a culture to provide people with opportunities that enhance their resilience. So it has these three different dimensions. The first one is how good we are at caring for ourselves, what we do in our lives and our capacity to manage our daily stresses and sometimes our bigger stresses. The second aspect of resilience comes from community support, belonging, and inclusion. And in fact, research shows that what matters the most to build our resilience is the quality of our relationships, our intimate relationships, friendships, professional networks. So people that we feel those three basic needs of safety, belonging, and dignity that are satisfied. And the third one is the capacity of the environment to support individuals and the opportunities that we have, the support that we get, the empowerment that we can have from the environment, such as, for example, training opportunities or building communities or healing processes. How much access do we have to healing and transformative processes that can help us? And please remember that as many of you here experience a lot of difficulties in finding your place or have experienced, I'm sure that you will remember or you can keep in mind those people, those systems, those opportunities that supported you in your darker moments, right? That were able to help you move through adversity and through difficult experiences. And I would like to share with you a very short video that defines resilience as a dynamic capacity, that keeps shifting according to the experiences that we have in our lives, and keeping in mind that we constantly have positive and negative experiences or stressful experiences in our lives. So I'm going to share that video with you.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
So as you could see from this video, it refers to the resilience of children because they are the ones who are really dependent on the environment. And as adults, we have more agency, but those principles apply to adults as well. And our capacity to respond is helped by the positive things that we have in our lives, and also by the way we have learned, you know, from the past to respond to these negative experiences. And at all times, we can be contributing to somebody else's resilience through the way we interact with them, or through the quality of service or of work that we do for them. And now I will mention a few aspects of what we can do ourselves in order to build our resilience, and what the system, or, you know, our environment can do in order to contribute to resilience. So I will mention these 4 different aspects for building resilience. The first one is the self-reflection. So really knowing what is important for us, noticing when we have particular needs, noticing what we feel, and being able to honor our emotions and our needs. Sometimes that it helps to keep a journal or to talk to others about our experiences. And it's interesting because if we have deep, good quality friendships, just being able to talk about one's thoughts, about one's emotions, is helpful in building our resilience. And it can be sometimes the equivalent of talking to a therapist or a counselor. The second aspect is building self-compassion, and building self-compassion is a way to accept more of our vulnerabilities and not be extremely judgmental of ourselves, and not be very hard on ourselves when we cannot achieve what we want to achieve. And this is about being able to embrace both your strengths, you know, what you're really good at, and accepting some of your vulnerabilities without being in this state of inner conflict, you know, really hating those traits of yourself that you're not very proud of. Building or cultivating, I keep using the word building, but in fact it's about this cultivation, you know, what we do every day that can enhance or decrease certain aspects, is cultivating kind and caring relationships, right? When we honor relationships, when we allow enough time for building relationships. And this is something that is difficult to do when our lives are extremely stressful and are extremely busy. It's difficult to build those spaces that are actually contributing to our resilience and nurturing our strength to actually do the work that we do. And the last one is that cultivation of gratitude and noticing all those good things in our lives. And in most of our lives, we have these, sometimes they are little positive things in our lives that we may not notice when we are under full distress experience, but noticing aspects of our lives that are positive, and talking to others about possibilities. Most of people's discussions focus on problems, you know, and what stresses me, what I don't like, what bothers me. And we pay less attention on talking about possibilities, you know, what is possible here, what excites me, what would I love to achieve or accomplish, right? So being able to engage in more conversations about these positive aspects and building them intentionally is contributing to our resilience. And then the basic aspects of self-care that sometimes is seen as this selfish indulgence that we just want to relax and we want to have fun and be joyful. But these are in fact moments when our resilience is enhanced by creating some spaciousness, you know, from the stresses of life, like taking walks in nature, spending time with family, creating these oases of calm in the middle of stress, right? So experiences of listening to music that you love, reading books that are contributing to your well-being, engaging in a mindfulness practice, expressing your needs and emotions, and sometimes looking for therapy, especially if you are in high levels of anxiety or Anxiety and depression are usually the most common disturbances of our psychological emotional system as a result of these trauma adaptation. And sometimes working with someone can really make a big difference in terms of allowing us to reconnect to our, to our core self, and to be able to engage with life from a more joyful and resilient perspective. And I know that therapy is more common in certain cultures. In other cultures, is seen in a negative way. It's sometimes even stigmatized. But in fact, therapy can really guide us towards a more balanced, a more peaceful and joyful way of being, which is really important for the quality of our lives and for the quality of our work as well. And before I move to the resilience that comes from the environment or from our social circumstances, I wanted to mention that the experiences of many IHPs in our program, and this comes from a study that was published by N4, A Missing Part of Me. And I really appreciated this title, because this title is really pinpointing the traumatic experience of not being able to engage in one's profession, despite many years of expertise, despite one's qualifications, despite everything that people bring. It takes a very long time to find their place. And that can also lead to long-term trauma adaptation and distress. And why that happens is because medicine is not just a job. For nurses and doctors, in most cases, I'm not saying that it's the same for everybody, but medicine tends to be a vocation. It's something deeply connected to a sense of personal identity, right? It's not just a job that I can change very easily into another job. But being deprived of the right to practice this job can lead to immense experiences of distress and lack of confidence as trauma adaptations, right? As people try and they meet obstacles, they try again, they meet obstacles, they start losing their self-confidence. And this is an example of trauma adaptation, when the environment is not conducive to resilience, right? The environment, in fact, is having a negative impact on people's resilience. And that can lead to a loss of dignity, right? That basic human need that I mentioned before. And feeling that some people share the sense that they are not valued here, they are not seen, they are not understood for who they are. And some of the issues, I know that many of you may be familiar with these issues already, but I wanted to mention that some of the difficulties is that experience in one's country of origin is not being recognized, differences between federal and provincial regulations, a fragmented system of navigation, complex and costly licensure process, this issue of cultural competency. And it's interesting because, and I'm going to say this, I hope it's not too risky, but I think that cultural competency is something that not only newcomers should involve or be involved in, but all Canadians, right? And the fact that if we are to develop cultural competency, it's both for people who come to Canada to adapt and to learn, the rules and regulations, but also for Canadians to understand more of different perspectives, different way of doing things. If we are to follow the ideal of multiculturalism, the lack of interprovincial mobility, the lack of centralized sources of information, financial costs, the issue of language for many people is difficult to get to the required level. The fact that refugees are in a gray zone, the regulations are different for them, and sometimes they're hard to understand. There is a small pool of available residency and work positions. And last but not least, the experiences of discrimination can lead to this this disheartening sense of feeling, lost and trying to constantly needing to recover one's resilience, right, despite adversity. So one of my hopes is that we can create enough changes in Canada so that the experience is not as difficult as it is currently. And the way that could be done, and these are ways in which resilience could be enhanced by the environment, is for a certain sector, for a certain culture, to provide good navigation, such as providing easy access to resources. And this is one way in which the system can contribute to individuals' well-being. And you may have noticed yourself, navigation, the easy navigation is so important. When you go to a doctor, being able to have the process going smoothly and quickly, which in many cases doesn't happen. Being able to go on a website and find the right information quickly, easily, being able to engage with an organization who could accompany you in accessing the desired information and resources. And second is providing enough resources or opportunities. And there are many organizations in Canada that are supporting newcomers, immigrants, and refugees with language, training, education, healing processes. What I noticed in my experience with the sector is that there are a lot of services offered, but there is no easy access, right? So sometimes there is a disconnect between the quality and the number of offered services and how people access them. There are many people who don't access these services. So I think that strengthening access for people to these services is really important. An environment that cultivates meaning. So for example, this program that we do in collaboration with and for fostering Canadian integration for IHPs, from the study that we did, we discovered that it cultivates a sense of hope and dignity, and it restores a healthy level of self-confidence, right? So it contributes to the resilience of participants through certain processes and ways of engagement. So the way the environment contributes to resilience is by building people's self-esteem, allowing opportunities for agency, right, where people can do the work that is important for them to do, and meaningful employment, which is very, very important. So I will mention a few aspects of the cultural traits that perpetuate trauma. The experience of oppression or discrimination based on one's identity, marginalization, not being able to express one's emotion, a fragmented and expensive care. So sometimes you can see this, how trauma and resilience plays at a larger systemic level when certain services are easily accessible and are helpful. That contributes to our resilience. When they are not, that contributes sometimes to experiences of trauma. Pressure to adjust too quickly after difficult events, right? Because we have this accelerated rhythm of life and we want to bounce back very quickly after, a difficult experience. Intrusive questions. This is why now many institutions teach trauma-informed care. Denial of needs, toxic stress. And I wanted to end my talk about a trauma-informed practice, which is a way for people and organizations to be aware of these issues. And I would say, like, I was trying to think, okay, if I am to define myself, what I would refer to as trauma-informed practice is about the capacity to have compassion for oneself and for other people. So I would say it's a compassion-based approach where we care about the distress and the suffering that we experience or other people experience. A complex understanding of issues, right? So we are able to listen more and to understand people's stories and where they come from, and to understand how their current behavior can be a reflection of their past experience. A commitment to do no harm or to reduce harm when possible, and a commitment to everyone's well-being, right? So it seems that these principles are quite straightforward in terms of engagement in trauma-informed practice. And there are these 5 different aspects that have been developed by the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and Safety. creating safety for people, giving them choice, right, when we engage with them, creating relationships based on trust, collaboration, and empowerment. And this is how we can build larger social systems that are contributing to resilience and that are not perpetuating or enhancing trauma adaptations. And this is a story that that was shared in a TED talk, a doctor from Afghanistan who was dreaming of becoming a doctor. So in 1992, at 16, when his city was taken over by Taliban, he had to leave. And the way he was talking about the experience of having to leave, showed how traumatic it was to know that he would not see his parents again when he left. So he left, and finally, after a very long journey that many refugees know, being in jail in different countries, being trafficked, living for a month in a barn, and these horrendous other experiences, he reached Netherlands, not speaking the language, not knowing anyone in 1998. So he had to learn the language, right, from zero. And in 5 years, he was enrolled in the medical school in Netherlands, and then he graduated. So just, understanding that life story gives you a sense of sometimes the experiences of adversity that people have to go through, and how they build that inner strength and capacity to overcome, and then to commit to the well-being of others. Because once he became a doctor, he started to create these nonprofit organizations working in Afghanistan and contributing to children's education. And there are many services that are available for newcomers, for refugees, that most of the time are free of charge, because they are funded by IRCC, such as Wellness Together Canada, Refugee Healthline, where you could call directly when you experience distress, Community Resources for Immigrant and Refugee Youth, Canadian Center for Immigrant and Refugee Healthcare Free Counseling. So knowing that there are these free and easily accessible services can be helpful, either if you experience distress yourself, or people who experience distress, or sometimes just having this sense that something is not quite right in your life. Sometimes we don't need to be in deep depression in order to look for support and accompaniment. Another center, this is a talk that I've seen at a conference we participated recently called Pathways to Prosperity. I Am Visible, where the organization was addressing domestic violence, the Canadian Center for Victims of Torture. So being able to check and access these services is crucial to undo these long-term trauma adaptations. So I want to thank you very much for your patience to be with me through this talk, and I will stop to see if you have questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Bianca. Excellent presentation and great coverage of the many, many elements related to trauma and resilience and mental health across the spectrum of both those that are newcomers and those that are working within our healthcare system that are also newcomers. It was that the fact that the quarter of the healthcare system is staffed with newcomers is a wild statistic to consider. So one of the questions that came actually to me was, what could mental health services at healthcare facilities do to better address stresses that are specific to newcomer trauma, for example?
Well, I think this is a very good question, because there are many organizations that offer these services for free. But I think that the lack of access sometimes is the problem, right? Not the absence of services, but the fact that people don't access these services. And then I thought, for example, in places where we teach language to people who come to Canada, maybe they could develop ways to let them know about these services and to create easy access, through pamphlets and sometimes through personal accompaniment. It's very difficult for people to come and just sit in front of the computer and look for services, and they get lost in the sea of many different possibilities. So I think that creating this more personal approach sometimes could be helpful, right? A teacher at the School of Language could talk to people about these services and engaging with them, and sometimes even larger institutions being able to offer these as part of the training or together with the training, right? Because I think that's really crucial.
Very important to bring awareness of the services that exist and what can be useful to help with alleviating some of the stressors, some of the trauma, helping with bringing together that resilience, that recovery. So from our audience, one of the questions that came forward was, what are the long-term impacts of traumatic experiences on very young children, infants and toddlers, for example?
That's a really important question. And I think that the effects of trauma depends on the age when it happens, and the earlier it happens, the deeper it tends to go. So sometimes that children who are affected at a level, for example, before they acquired language, then they need, for example, a type of therapy later on in life that does not necessarily rely on talk therapy, right? There are these somatic ways to address trauma, and there are ways to work with people through artistic means or other means in order to. So it is possible to undo the effects of trauma, but they need a different type of, so just what we call the traditional, I know it's not always traditional therapy, may not work for children who experienced early trauma in their early years.
Right, and it can manifest in many different ways later on in life. Very, very, very important to just understand that element. One of the questions was, many youth, and along with a comment, many youth in our programs express that they're stressed when adults compliment them on their resilience, saying things like, "You're so resilient, good for you, you've overcome so much," and the way they feel this shouldn't be seen to them as a compliment because they didn't need to be resilient in this way. Do you have any comments on how we could honor that while also still recognizing the importance of helping clients develop resilience for well-being?
This comment is so interesting because I think that for a very long time resilience was seen as the responsibility of people, right? Where the others who actually contributed to harm were invisible and were not included in the discussion. And I think that it's the way we could honor the resilience of young people. It needs to also be accompanied by a recognition of the harm that was done, and how should I put it, responsibilization of the social network, around the youth and maybe the type of traumas that they experienced, and how they had to develop their resilience without them necessarily wanting to, right? The fact that it's almost like you have to build this strength because you were harmed, but it would have been so much easier if you haven't been harmed from the very beginning. And I think recognizing the responsibility of all our institutions, right, to not contribute to harm. And of course we have large scale institutions that contribute to so much harm, like so much war and violence and many difficult experiences for people.
Almost expressing empathy towards the trauma that they experience, but not necessarily bringing it towards that compliment, rather the understanding that it happened and that they very much the individual may not understand what exactly it was like, but just recognizing it happened, right?
Yeah, so being with them, compassionately through the understanding that their resilience was in a way forced on them.
Yeah. Looking through the questions, I've recently been reading about cultural awareness as a goal rather than cultural competence. It seems to be more achievable as a first step towards a longer term goal for true cultural competence.
So this refers to cultural awareness versus cultural competence?
It sounds like that.
Well, I think one of the aspects about that is that in an ideal world, we would all be able to engage with other people's stories, right? We would be able to listen to them, to see films, to read books, to understand, so this is the cultural awareness piece, right? Where we have some sense of what is happening and what people experience in different cultures. And for example, when I was doing film studies in my in one of my masters, I learned so much from documentaries or from films, in different countries about how people lived, because that gives us an in-depth experience. And cultural competency is how we engage that awareness, how we are able to have this maybe less of a judgmental attitude towards people and a more understanding, more compassionate or way of relating, by recognizing that their context was different, recognizing that their behavior may be different, and sometimes maybe it's hard for us to understand why they behave in certain ways. So I think that cultural awareness tends to build cultural competency because we relate differently to people.
Thank you. And one final question before we wrap things up. How does the type and quality of professional support received in the aftermath of trauma influence long-term resilience? And what can be effective therapeutic approaches and even key mindfulness practices?
Effective intervention immediately after a traumatic event can have very important long-term consequences, because it actually mitigates, right, the adaptations to trauma. And there are many interventions that are being done, for example, by therapists in disaster zones or in war zones, where they go and they engage with people on the ground, as they come out of these experiences, and sometimes with children. And this intervention is really important. And sometimes for refugees is more difficult, because I've seen some interventions where they go, for example, in refugee camps, and they work with people there on the ground. So that has important consequences over long term. It's almost like you empower people immediately before they start changing their psychological mechanism, right? So that tends to help a lot. And there are many new therapies that address trauma. And for example, mindfulness is something that we can do ourselves, right? And mindfulness-based therapy is also a way to do therapy, but mindfulness is how we empower ourselves. And I wanted to say that for people with very difficult experiences of trauma, it's difficult to engage alone in mindfulness, just because mindfulness is triggering reactions and memories that are difficult and unpleasant, because mindfulness is about getting to know our thoughts, our emotions, what is in our inner world. And
behavioral therapy.
Yeah. So, and there are somatic therapies that I also find very helpful, because they lead to more transformation, right? Transformation that also, it's not only about how we think and our worldview, but also how we feel in our bodies and how we relate to other people. That tends to be very helpful. Then there are collective interventions for engaging people with their stories and being able to restore a sense of trust and belonging, which is also important. So there are these new developments in therapies that address more effectively these long-term effects of trauma, rather than only talk therapy, which is usually what we associate therapy with.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. And this has been an excellent discussion. And we definitely will even bring this forward into the new year with the upcoming January 24th webinar that Bianca as well will be joining us to discuss recovering hope and agency in the disorienting dilemma of immigration as an IHP. And thank you once again, Bianca, for taking time to participate in today's discussion. And many thanks to you, the audience, for joining with us and engaging with us today. You're very much welcome to join us again for any of our upcoming events. If you missed any part of today's presentation as well, or would like to watch it again, we will be posting this recording to the N4 website within the next week or so. As well, we very much want to continue the dialogue that this webinar has begun, and we'll be moving any questions that we didn't get a chance to address to our online moderated discussion forum called The Meeting Place, and I'll follow up with Bianca with respect to the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer there. We've also curated several resources related to today's webinar topic, and you can find these in our resource toolkit, and we will link them when we share the on-demand version of this presentation as well. So if you haven't yet, please sign up to newcomernavigation.ca for all our resources and learning opportunities. And following this session, you will be invited to complete a brief survey to share your feedback. We very much appreciate your responses to these surveys as it helps with developing future N4 webinars. So please follow the link and complete this brief survey, or you'll be directed there once this webinar has concluded. So before we say a final goodbye, are there any final wrap-up takeaways that you'd like to say, Bianca?
Well, I just wanted to thank you, everyone, for being here with me, and I hope that you will either access some of the services or engage in some of the self-care practices, or even understand better some of your own patterns of responding to the world. And I hope that will be helpful over long term for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bianca. And finally, check out our mobile app available on the Apple and Google Play stores. And with that said, thank you again. We hope that you can see us at a future N4 event. Stay safe and stay well, everybody.